we're going to kind of go back to a region that we talked about a couple units ago, which is the New World, Latin America mostly, but also North America. And so this part of the world's different than Asia and Africa in the sense that European imperialism and colonial efforts in places like Africa and Asia, while they did exist in the in the 1400s and 1500s, they become much more intense in the 1800s and early 1900s. Latin America is different on the other hand because when the New World is discovered, Christopher Columbus, 1492, that's when this part of the world kind of gets colonized and intensely colonized, right? To the point where these nations are kind of ruling directly all over the place. And over time, those colonies in the New World, in Latin America and North America, they eventually become independent, right? We get the United States, we get Haiti, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, all these countries form. Um, so during this time period, while European powers are more directly trying to colonize in parts of Asia and Africa and the Pacific Islands, they're doing it a bit differently in Latin America. It's more about economic influence and economic imperialism in Latin America, and not any efforts to kind of take direct control over these places. But this part of the unit's kind of helping to catch us up, so to speak, on what's going on in parts of Latin America while everything else is going on in the world that we just mentioned. So, a quick overview. The different kind of social classes at the time. You have the Peninsulares. They were overthrown during those revolutions in the beginning of the 1800s. And the Creoles, those kind of European blooded but American born people, take control. And the mestizos, the mulattoes, and the blacks and Indians still kind of are at the bottom of the social status. And once that kind of system is replaced, it's replaced by um, a more binary system where you have conservatives on one end and liberals on the other. Conservatives were supportive of the monarchy. So, in particular, in Mexico, there's a monarchy at first, and the conservatives are supportive of them. They also tend to be supportive of traditional rule, kind of more, those who are more qualified, so to speak, those who are more elite should rule. And they're also much more strongly supportive of the Catholic Church. The liberals, on the other hand, are those who kind of go back to the ideas of the French Revolution and support those Enlightenment ideas, as well as these laissez-faire economics, capitalism, so to speak. So that's kind of what's happening, and in a couple places we're going to see a constant back and forth between those two forces in society. The conflict between these two forces ultimately leads to the coming and going of different, what's called in Spanish the caudillos, or local military leaders, essentially local generals or rulers that come to power, taking advantage of this situation. So Mexico, for example, is one we're going to highlight and go into detail with. One of these caudillos is General Santa Anna. If anyone knows anything about American history, you might recognize his name because he is the man who goes to war against the United States in the Mexican-American War. And this all starts with the territory that we now know as Texas. Was starting to be settled by many white Americans, but it was controlled by Mexico. Ultimately, there's tension that rises, and the Texans go to war with the Mexicans. Um, the Texans win independence, and they eventually then become part of the United States. And then shortly after this, General Santa Anna and the United States go to war in the Mexican-American War. And at this point, the Mexicans lose this war, and they're forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which results to Mexico losing almost half of its territory. And that territory is all land that we would now associate with being in the United States, right? Parts of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada. All that land now is part of the United States, and Mexico loses it. Right, so this map kind of helps show us this. Mexico is the regions in green here, and then this white territory here, and this little bit of red. And Texas used to all be part of Mexico, and the United States gains that through that conflict. So the United States is kind of more directly involved in imperial efforts in Latin America than other nations are, particularly with Mexico, this conflict between Mexico and the U.S. In Mexico, you have this constant kind of pendulum swing between conservatives to liberals. And one famous leader is who was known by the name La Reforma, the Reformer, was a man named Benito Juarez, who kind of came to power in 1855. And his goal was to try to liberalize Mexico. So he was kind of that liberal end, trying to institute laissez-faire economics, trying to kind of loosen the ties between the church and the government, things like that. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what side you view this from, uh, he meets resistance from the conservatives in the country, who turn to France for help. And during the same time period, you have Not Napoleon, but Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, who, as you remember from our previous unit, the Nationalism and Revolution unit, he goes from establishing the Second Republic to then leading to the establishment of the Second Empire, right? So he was Emperor Napoleon III, and the conservatives in Mexico convince him to send troops to Mexico. And when this happens, they install an Austrian, a man named Maximilian, as emperor. So Mexico has this really unique history where it goes from being, Spanish controlled to being independent, to then being controlled by the French to some degree through an Austrian, and then eventually they gain their independence again. Juarez leads a rebellion against the French here and ultimately wins, and the Mexicans regain their independence. But conservatives are still a potent force in the country, and they limit many reforms or efforts to change how things were. The pendulum swings the other way towards conservatives when a man named General Porfirio Diaz seizes control, and he rules for a pretty long time, from the 1876 through 1911. He was a dictator, right? He had one-party rule. He was a dictator. He did some beneficial things for Mexico, like helping it to industrialize, but overall, the lack of democracy and mistreatment of lower-class Mexicans will cause tensions. So Mexico, and this is just Mexico, but it's kind of characteristic of much of the Spanish-speaking region at this time. In Central and South America and the Caribbean, most of those places go from being economically dependent on Spain and Portugal during that original age of imperialism, the 1500s, to by the 1800s and 1900s being economically dependent on the more industrialized nations like the United States and Great Britain. Right? And so these nations like the United States and Great Britain are able to kind of help control prices and keep the flow of trade so it's beneficial for the Americans and the British, but maybe not as beneficial for these people living in these countries. Countries like Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela and Mexico all begin to industrialize, right? And even today, many people call many nations in Latin America developing nations. I don't know how fair that is to call all those nations developing still, but at this time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, nations like Mexico and Chile and Brazil are starting to industrialize more. And these are kind of the different resources they have that they can industrialize or base their industrialization on. Chile has copper, Brazil has coffee, rubber, and sugar. Argentina has livestock, right? And wheat, like farming regions. Venezuela and Mexico eventually develop oil. And when oil becomes an important resource in the industrial process, they become important nations. Right, the U.S. ultimately becomes very involved in Latin America. There's a couple reasons for that. And so this political cartoon is showing us President Theodore Roosevelt, who rules in the early 1900s, beginning the first decade of the 1900s. And essentially he kind of sees himself and sees America as the police force of the Latin American world. And he kind of intercedes and interferes in things that are going on, typically for the benefit of American businesses. So, for example, if in Dominican Republic, for example, he sends troops in because they are failing to pay back debts they owe to the United States and to businessmen in the United States, and so America occupies the Dominican Republic for a little bit, right? And they do that in lots of other parts of the Caribbean and Latin America. And so U.S. foreign policy throughout the 1800s, is really based on originally the Monroe Doctrine, which was established by President James Monroe back in 1823, where he said that no European power should be involved in Latin America, right? That it's not their sphere of influence, it's in fact the United States' sphere of influence. Then in 1898, this kind of accelerates more with the Spanish-American War. From the American perspective, it's called the Splendid Little War, where the United States gains control of Cuba and Puerto Rico, and as well as the Philippine Islands in the Pacific. Cuba eventually does gain its independence, but allows the U.S. to keep territory, especially naval bases. One kind of famous one is the Guantanamo Bay, which you may have heard of. It's still kind of in the news today. And then 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt issues kind of a corollary or an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, and it becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary. And this is the idea that the United States should take a more active role, not just that the Europeans shouldn't be involved, but the Americans should take an active role in policing the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, in order to protect American interests in these Latin American nations. So throughout his tenure and later on as well, troops are eventually sent to places like the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Cuba to protect these business interests. Another kind of famous example of American imperialism in Latin America is the construction of the Panama Canal. So Panama is this nation here, right? At the time, it was controlled by Colombia, and it's a really small isthmus, right? A really small, narrow piece of land, and so it was the ideal location to build a canal, to cut down travel time between the east and west coast of the United States. However, at the time, like I said, Panama was controlled by Colombia, and Colombia did not want the United States, did not allow the United States to construct this canal. So what the U.S. does when it doesn't get its way is that it backs a rebellion in Panama, and helps Panama gain independence. Once Panama has its independence, that new nation now allows the U.S. to construct the canal. Construction begins in 1904, and the canal opens in 1914. And this is a really key moment because it cuts down trading and travel time between New York City, say, and San Francisco, um, by more than half, right? It goes from a 13,000-mile trip around the tip of South America, also down in South America here, this tip, it's very dangerous, rough seas, to now only a 5,200-mile trip through the Panama Canal. That also means that shipping from China, say, to New York City, or New York City to China, vice versa, becomes much more cheap, much more cost effective. The picture on the right there is a photo of the Panama Canal being built. It really is kind of an engineering marvel. It took 10 years to construct, and today it's still a key trading route in the world. The U.S. no longer controls it. The Panama Canal has been returned to Panama, but it's a key trading route in the United States. Sorry, for the United States and for the world. And lastly here, right, they're not Latin American, but they are part of the Western Hemisphere, and that's Canada. Canada was also settled much earlier in history before this current period, but it's just some things to help us catch up what's happening in Canada. So by 1760s, the French and the British had colonized different parts of Canada. But then in 1763, with a war called the French and Indian War, the British gained control of all of Canada. And so the French-speaking part, known as Quebec, and the English-speaking part at the time, Ontario, eventually they expand to other parts as well, are the two major colonies in Canada. The people in Quebec, the French-speaking people, are not thrilled to be controlled by the British. Even today, there was a small but present independence movement in Quebec. But over time, during this time period, this age of imperialism, Canada kind of matures as a nation, and they gain in 1840. The two colonies are united into one, and then by 1867, the Great Britain establishes what's known as the Dominion of Canada, which gives Canada self-governing status. So technically speaking, Canada was not independent yet at this point, right? They were still part of the British Commonwealth, and even today, if you look at the money in Canada, it's going to have the image of the Queen on it because it's still part of that, right? The Queen of England is still the head of state, right, for Canada. She has no actual power over Canada, but it's kind of more of a symbolic relationship today, and that starts back in 1867. So that's just kind of catching us up here on what's going on in the Western Hemisphere, because we kind of focus on the Eastern Hemisphere for most of this unit. So I wanted to just make sure we catch up on this as well.